Newborn!
Newborn! The word came from all around her, angry shouts from alien voices. Sound and meaning felt like two separate entities that her brain had arduously linked together. Alexandra hadn't yet opened her eyes when something blunt and heavy struck her shoulders and sent her tumbling forward. She hit the floor with a startled yelp and plunged through a mantle of gravel, sharp edges scoring shallow gashes on her hands, her arms, her brow, jaw, and cheek. She came to a painful stop shortly after, and by then the single word had become an unintelligible roar. Alexandra had time to gasp for air once, twice. Something grabbed a fistful of hair and pulled her halfway to her feet, dragging her further across the floor. She cried out, the shock and pain finally jolting her addled mind into action. Her vision blurred by blood and tears, her legs struggling to gain footing, Alexandra desperately flailed her arms at the unseen assailant. After a few fruitless swings, her fist connected with flesh, barely encountering friction as it punched through. Her eyes focused. A nightmarish creature ruptured in an explosion of gore as her arm tore through its body like a sledgehammer through gelatin. The inner spattered in all directions, splashing onto her face and blinding her momentarily. Alexandra quickly crawled away, eyes squeezed shut, face twisted in horror. Whatever that thing had been, there was nothing on earth like it. She tried to wipe her eyes clean, but only smeared the viscous fluids further, making the sting worse. The stench burned the inside of her nose like sulfur fumes. Her high-pitched sobs drowned in the screams closing in around her. All at once they grabbed her, tough and leathery limbs tightening around her ankle, her elbow, her thigh. Something slid around her neck and threatened to crush her windpipe. Then everything started pulling. She thrashed and contorted as hard as she could, but they held fast. She fought to breathe, but her throat was clamped shut. Panic seized Alexandra as their grip tightened and their pull built to an unbearable degree. They were trying to tear her apart. The need to get away overwhelmed her. The sense of powerlessness roused the memory, and with the memory everything came crashing back. The anguish, the loathing, the shame and humiliation. Long-healed scars tore wide open, and a voice cried inside her mind, instinctive, outraged, desperate. Never again! Anger blazed in her chest. Once more she could see their faces, twisted with hatred, shrouded in the despair of the hopeless, their hands holding her down, stifling her screams. And the stink, that rancid mixture of mud and dank sweat, lust, human filth. She'd been frail back then. Scrawny, malnourished, far too young. Not anymore. The anger fed on the memory of their touch, their eyes, their stench, and it all went up in flames, consumed by Alexandra's unbound rage. A feral scream made its way through her constricted throat as her arm broke free through sheer brute force. Unable to open her eyes, she saw everything unfold in her mind. Her hand grabbed at whatever was around her neck, and pulled, and tore the appendage of its owner. Her legs kicked savagely, her foot smashing into another of the creatures and sending it flying away in a gooey mess. She writhed in their grasp, flailing limbs fighting desperately against the monster's pull. They let go. Immediately she sprung to her feet and swung her arm backwards at another of her captures. It sliced effortlessly through its midsection like a well-honed scythe, splitting the beast in two. Her arm continued its unwavering arc, inertia spinning her around to face the next creature. She screamed and threw her whole body into a wide hook. Her clenched fist made contact, broke through body tissue and tore a gaping hole in the thing's side. The monster gargled, staggered, and hit the ground with a spattering thud. The rest of them fled in terror. Their incoherent shrieks faded in the distance. Her eyes remained squeezed shut, the burn from the blinding grime slowly subsiding. She'd felt a sense of detachment in her frenzy, as though watching herself in an out-of-body experience. Now Alexandra saw herself standing there, dark skin covering muck, muscles tense, chest heaving. Her clothes were drenched in the same disgusting substance, small bits of whatever these things were still clinging to the fabric. She was terribly disappointed to see her favorite sweatpants ruined beyond repair. At that moment, she still nurtured a small glimmer of hope. Maybe she would open her eyes to find herself in her moonlit bedroom, sheets damp with sweat, and the air filled with Aaron snoring. She would nudge him gently, he'd turn to his side, and she'd go back to sleep, never to remember this awful nightmare. Alexandra clung to this hope, even as she felt the creature's vile juices dripping from her hands, the sting of the gravel under her naked feet, the ache of blooming welts on her limbs. Her eyelids could finally part to a squint. After a moment of painful blinking, her vision came into focus. She stared at the mangled corpses and yellowish sludge scattered all over the hallway in which she stood. The unnatural color of their fluids looked more like vomit than blood. Lumps of body parts, innards, and chunks of flesh added to the image, all mixing in unsightly mounds. Rather than the result of her desperate battle for survival, the area looked more like the aftermath of some massive monster's sickly hangover. Alexandra stared, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She glanced at her hands, at the bodies, at the hallway and her own blood, unable to stop looking from one horror to the next. "You know what these things are, Alex?" She took a step back. Her eyes surveyed the alien environment with newfound dread. The nascent realization sent a chill through her skin. "You know what happened to you, what this means." "No." She shook her head, lips trembling. The ground spun beneath her feet as the inescapable truth sunk in. "No, no, 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 no." She staggered back a few more steps, shaky hands seeking purchase. Without even noticing, she bumped against one of the pillars that lined the hall. "You know where you are." Alexandra fell to her knees and hugged her arms to her abdomen, breath short and ragged. Deep, mournful sobs seized her throat. Her chest felt as if gripped by unseen fists. She squeezed her eyes shut and wept for as long as tears would flow.